Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for making it to tonight's talk on global capitalism, the solution to world oppression and poverty. I'm Jonathan Burgos, president of the Objectivist Club. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker for tonight, Dr. Andrew Bernstein. Dr. Bernstein holds a PhD in philosophy from the Graduate School of the City University of New York. He is an Ayn Rand Institute speaker and a visiting professor of philosophy at Marist College. He also teaches at the State University of New York at Purchase, which selected him Outstanding Teacher of the Year in 2004. Dr. Bernstein is the author of the Capitalist Manifesto, the historic, economic, and philosophic case for laissez-faire. That's it right there.
Which is for sale.
Which is for sale. Objectivism in One Lesson, an introduction to the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Capitalism Unbound, the incontestable moral case for individual rights. And his latest book, Capitalist Solutions, a philosophy of American moral dilemmas.
Which is also for sale.
That's right. He has also written three cliff notes for three Ayn Rand titles: Anthem, The Fountainhead, and Atlas Shrugged. And now please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Andrew Bernstein.
Thank you, Jonathan. As you know, the topic for tonight is global capitalism, the solution to world oppression and poverty. Now, a proper understanding of global capitalism is sorely lacking today because more fundamentally, an understanding is lacking of capitalism in general, of its nature, its history, and its benefits. Now, this talk seeks to accomplish two tasks. One, to show the enormous universal benefits of global capitalism, and two, to explain that and how these benefits flow directly and necessarily from capitalism's basic nature. Now, it's possible to start with an example. During World War II, Hong Kong's economy was badly damaged excuse me, by Japanese occupation. And making matters worse, several years later, a flood of refugees arrived, fleeing the communist conquest of mainland China. In the mid-1950s, many of the penniless Chinese who had fled the mainland subsisted in temporary quarters, in one-room cells in a multi-story building that was open in the front. One family, one room. Like many third-world countries, Hong Kong was desperately poor. In 1960, for example, its average per capita income was only 25% of that in Great Britain, mother country. But in the 40 years subsequent to that, its economic progress was one of the great success stories of human history. Hong Kong developed productive industries in textiles, electronics, plastics, watches, and clocks. It became the leading financial center of East Asia. By 1996, just 36 years later, its per capita income was 137% that of its former mother country, Great Britain. Average individual wealth by the late 1990s in Hong Kong was greater than in Germany or even in Japan. Prior to the Asian crisis of the late 90s, its per capita wealth was creeping up on that in the United States, the world's wealthiest country. Today, its per capita income is in the mid-$20,000 range, making it one of the most prosperous places on earth. Indeed, making it one of the most prosperous places in the history of this earth. Now, in a mere 4 decades, at a breakneck pace, Britain's island colony rose. What factor or factors made possible such extraordinary economic growth? Perhaps it should first be noted those factors that were not responsible. Hong Kong has virtually none of the elements that modern intellectuals generally view as a source of wealth. The island has almost zero natural resources. Hong Kong has no oil, no coal, no iron ore, no timber, no fertile agricultural lands. The former Soviet Union, for example, had vastly more such natural resources, as do many African countries, yet they were and are poor, even destitute, while Hong Kong is wealthy. Further, Hong Kong has an extraordinarily high population density, which is a factor that modern thinkers generally view as a source of poverty. The Sham Sui Po district of Kowloon, for example, has a population density of greater than 425,000 people per square mile, which makes it 18 times as crowded as my native New York City. Hong Kong per square mile has 14 times as many people as Japan, 20 times as many as India, and 185 times as many as the United States. While Hong Kong has, as do many places, a great harbor, its greatest natural resource is one that it shares with every country on earth: the intelligence of its inhabitants. What enables Hong Kong to employ that intelligence to create wealth more effectively than other places is a factor that is not natural but is man-made: political economic freedom. In Hong Kong, an individual needed no bureaucratic permission to initiate his own business. He could simply start it up and apply later for a permit. The city became an entrepreneurial hotbed. Imagine the horror of the anti-capitalist socialist mentality if it was said to them, what if there were a country in which the government basically stays out of the economy? One with no tariffs or other legal restrictions on international free trade, with no regulatory agencies, no minimum wage laws, no price or wage controls. Imagine it was said to the socialists that the government limits neither investment coming in nor profit going out. There's no capital gains tax, no interest tax, no sales tax, and a pittance in corporate bailouts for companies that fail to compete on a free market. This imaginary country has a 15% flat tax, enabling its citizens to keep the overwhelming preponderance of their earnings. Further, it extends no unemployment benefits, enacts no labor legislation, and provides no Social Security, no national health insurance, and scarcely any welfare. The welfare status would recoil in horror from such a proposal. He would drown his questioner with dire warnings regarding the misery of the numberless poor and exploited who would be the inevitable victims of such a heartless, callous system. But in fact, that country exists. It is real. It is Hong Kong, one of the richest places of history. To answer my question succinctly, capitalism is responsible for Hong Kong's wealth. But what is capitalism? What is its nature and its defining essence? The freedom to open your own business and to trade unrestrictedly across national boundaries, as in Hong Kong, is a derivative issue. It is one consistent application of capitalism's fundamental nature: respect for the rights and the freedom of the individual. That's the essence of the capitalist system, the principle of individual rights. Your life belongs to you, not to the state, not to society, not to God, not to the tribe. Your life belongs to you. The essence of the capitalist system is a limited government which protects the right of an individual to live by his or her own judgment in all areas of life, including both personal morality and economics. Such a system, for example, guarantees individuals freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of intellectual expression. Individuals are free to earn and to own property, their own homes, their own farms, their own land. They are free to start their own businesses and to retain the profits that they earn. Capitalism provides a rule of law that protects private property, safeguards investments, and enforces contractual agreements. The overarching principle is that capitalism is the system of individual rights. Capitalism, as Ayn Rand defined it, is, quote, the system of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned. That's Ayn Rand's definition, so let me repeat that. Capitalism is the system of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned. Now, deeper, capitalism is based on the moral code of rational egoism, or what Ayn Rand refers to as selfishness. The code that recognizes an individual's need to attain the values that his life requires. That the nature of human life requires an individual to use his own mind and put forth his own effort to earn the values upon which his survival, prosperity, and happiness depend. Capitalism protects an individual's inalienable right to pursue his own happiness. It is the only political economic system consistent with the moral principle that an individual has the right to his own life. And it is the only system, therefore, that consistently repudiates the slave driver theory that men owe selfless service to others, whether to society, the state, the race, the tribe, or the proletariat. Now, capitalism's history has been so largely ignored, or worse, distorted by Marxist professors and journalists, that it is important to identify some of its most important points. For example, Great Britain during the 18th and 19th centuries was the first European nation to gradually throw off, or completely throw off, the oppression of feudalism and the monarchy, and begin to institute a system of individual rights. Also during this period, during the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain's North American colonies, the 18th century, fomented a historic revolution that established the freest country of history. In the 19th century, the ideals of individualism, limited government, and capitalism gradually spread to most of the nations of Western Europe, leading there to the overthrow of the ancient regime. You know, the dictatorship of the aristocracy and the monarchy. And some of those countries like France, the church. For the next 100 years, individual rights, freedom, and capitalism existed exclusively in Western Europe and North America. Now, what were the results? What were the practical results of such freedom in the Western world? One leading economist, Angus Madison, estimates that in Europe in 1700, just 300 years ago, per capita income was roughly $265. Think about that. It's Western Europe, just 300 years ago. I think of that in my own mind as third world Europe. Most European nations, drop the most, all European nations were akin to Africa today. Desperately poor, famine-ridden countries. In fact, third world Europe was vastly more destitute than any place in Africa today, even Somalia, which may be one of the 2 or 3 poorest nations on earth. Because anywhere you go in Africa today, you will find at least some benefits of modern technology, modern agriculture, modern medicine, airplanes, automobiles, computers. None of those things existed 300 years ago in Europe, for the simple reason that none of them had been invented yet. They're all products of the capitalist system. It's hard for people in the Western world today to remember. Well, one reason it's hard to remember is they don't teach history anymore. You know, they've so dumbed down the American educational system that they don't teach history. But we take for granted, if we born and raised in America, we take for granted the wealth that we have. I like to joke that in the United States we're proudly the fattest people of history. You know, we just take the abundance of food for granted. But I understand, being overweight has its own set of problems. But it's a very different set of problems than having your 3-year-old son or daughter die of starvation, which happens all over the non-capitalist world to this day, and was prevalent throughout Europe just 300 years ago, prior to the capitalist revolution. Now, Britain's technological and industrial revolution of the late 18th and 19th centuries brought enormous progress. For the first time in centuries, the minds of the common man, commoners as they were known, the minds of the commoners were freed from bondage to the feudal aristocracy, to the king, and to the established religions. Free to ask and answer philosophic and scientific questions, to apply newly developed principles to practical concerns, to invent technologies, to industrialize, and to manufacture vastly increased supplies of consumer goods. James Watt, as one outstanding example, the representative inventor of the 18th century, perfected the steam engine, the so-called work engine of the Industrial Revolution, which immeasurably increased man's ability to manufacture the goods that their lives required. George Stephenson is another example, pioneered the design of locomotives and the construction of railroads. All of these, Edward Jenner created a vaccine for smallpox, one of history's deadliest killers. All of these thinkers and many more were commoners whose minds and activities would have been stifled under the ancient regime that continued to hold sway on the European continent. It was Britain's far greater political economic freedom, her recognition, her burgeoning recognition of individual rights that provided the social conditions her most innovative minds required to promote unprecedented material progress. In the 19th century, based on advances in applied science, technology, industrialization, medicine, and agriculture, made possible by the liberation of the human mind in Britain, the standard of living increased dramatically. The life expectancy rose significantly from, according to the leading demographic researchers of British history, in 1760, on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, the life expectancy in Great Britain did not reach 35 years. It tripled during the not the life expectancy, the living standards and per capita income rose dramatically. Europe's population tripled during the 19th century. In Britain, Europe's freest nation, per capita living standards rose during the 19th century while the population more than tripled. You think about that. That's staggering. Per capita living standards rose while the population more than tripled. What that means, of course, is production of goods and services had to more than triple in order for living standards to rise. These are historically unprecedented numbers. Now, for example, British real wages in the decades from 1781 to 1851. Now, real wages is a I'm a philosopher, not an economist, but I know economics 101. Real wages is a critical principle in the field of economics, because if you can measure somebody's wealth, the economists make the distinction between monetary or nominal wages on the one hand and real wages on the other. So monetary wages, as the name indicates, is your income measured in terms of how much money you make. So to keep the arithmetic simple, if I make $10 an hour, there's my monetary wage. And over a 40-hour work week, that's $400. Now, other things being equal, it's always better to make more money than less. But it's as the economists point out, it's an enormous, how much money I make is enormously secondary to my living standards. Because I could make $5 million an hour and be poor. So $5 million an hour, it's $200 million a week on a 40-hour work week. How can I make $200 million a week and be poor? Well, yeah. Well, if the price of a loaf of bread costs $1 trillion, then then I could be poor. If the government hyperinflates the money supply, as in Weimar Germany, for example, or in recent Zimbabwe, or in other ill-fated nations, then I could be then I could be destitute on $5 million an hour. The key point that economists make here about wages is this: it's not what's important is not how much money I make. What's important is how much can I buy with the money I make. And real wages is your income measured in terms of purchasing power. Not how much money do you make, but how much can you buy with the money you make. So the important point about wages is not how high they are. The important point about wages is how high they are relative to prices. Obviously, you want to bring the prices down. How do you do that? Well, I'm not an economist, but I know this much economics. The basic principle of economics is supply and demand, and that is if you increase the supply of X relative to demand for X, then the price of X is going to tend to decline, right? And if you increase demand for X relative to supply of X, then the price of X is going to tend to rise. So you need to to raise real wages, to raise purchasing power. What we need to do is enormously increase the supply of consumer goods. Right? If we enormously increase the supply of consumer goods relative to demand for those goods, then prices for those goods will decline and real wages rise. And how do you enormously increase the supply of consumer goods? There's only one possible way you could ever do it, the only way it's ever been done, and that is you have to go through a scientific, technological, and industrial revolution. You've got to use mind power, that is machine power, to manufacture consumer goods, not just muscle power of human beings or of draft animals added to human beings. And this is exactly what the British Industrial Revolution accomplished. The Watt's perfection of the steam engine and its application to what goes into manufacture with Matthew Boulton in Birmingham, England. They mass-produced the steam engine. The historians, history is not an exact science, but you could date the Industrial Revolution, the inception of the Industrial Revolution, to 1785. It's as good a date as any. That's when the powerful Watt and Boulton steam engines are first applied to driving the mules in England's textile factories. And you start to churn out cotton clothing and textiles by mass production. They're no longer made by weavers on hand looms. Now you're churning them out through machine power, by mass production, and you enormously increase the supply of cotton clothing. And this is the start of the Industrial Revolution. You can see the difference in any field you want to name today. Let's leave the unions aside for just a second. And just imagine, you have construction workers going to build a house. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, what are we going to build the house with? We're going to dig the foundations with what? Shovels. Shovels are most efficient when they're made out of iron or steel. Yeah. Manufacturing iron or steel prior to the Industrial Revolution was difficult, so we're using wood. Using wooden tools. How long would it take to, by hand? It'd take forever. But today, you're digging the foundations with steam shovels and derricks and cranes and using power tools. Leave the unions aside. We could leave. We could even with the unions, slowing down the productive process. It's much quicker, much more efficient to build houses today. Subtract the coercive unions from the equation, and you could build houses much more quickly even than we do today. Consequently, the supply of housing rises from the pre-industrial revolution. Now I have a question. I don't even know the answer to this, but I could guess. When did it become a realizable dream, home ownership for millions of people? I don't know the exact answer to that question, but I know it's a post-industrial revolution phenomenon. It has to be. So I'm guessing it'll be 20th century America. That the supply of housing becomes so available. The supply of housing is so much larger relative to what it was prior to the Industrial Revolution that now millions and millions of people could earn enough money to earn their own home. This is the way you bring prices down, raise real wages, and consequently fight a real war on poverty, raise living standards across an entire society. Again, you've got to go through, in order to do this, in order to raise real wages, you have to vastly increase the supply of consumer goods relative to the demand for those goods, and the only way to do that is to go through a scientific, technological, and industrial revolution. This begins in Great Britain, late 18th century. Now, the numbers, as you would expect, we know from the field of economic history today, British real wages in the decades of from the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution, the number from 1781 to 1851, showed that real wages in Britain show an increase, an average increase in excess of 60% for farm workers, over 86% for blue-collar workers, and more than 140% for all workers, including white-collar ones. Now, this is one of the things that's historically interesting. Here's Marx and Engels living in Great Britain, right through the heart of the Industrial Revolution. What are Marx's dates? 1818 to 1883. Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto in 1848. And talking about the destitute conditions of Britain's factory workers, which, relative to our standards, they certainly were. And Marx and Engels point out, well, these poor guys are working for a pittance in wages. They're making $1 a day or whatever they were making, looking only at the monetary wage that the British working class was receiving. And the modern economists, of course, disdain Marx and Engels on this because they completely overlook the enormous increase in purchasing power for the British working class. You know, how much more coal was available, price of coal lower, so that the British working class in 1848, when Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto, the British workers could buy much more coal to heat whatever home that they lived in. They could buy much more food than their grandparents could, etc., etc. That is, the Marx and Engels, of course, looking only at the monetary wage, or the nominal wage of the British working class, not looking at how real wages had risen dramatically within their own lifetime. Now, one practical result in Britain and later in America of such rise in real income was the end of the ages-old practice of child labor. Because now mom and dad were able mom and dad were not, their real wages were sufficient to support their offspring without the need for children to provide income. Child labor exists today, and in a widespread form, only in the non-capitalist third world and throughout the non-capitalist third world. It existed all over the world prior to the capitalist revolution, and it was capitalism that put an end to that. The rise in real wages enabled parents to support their children. Children didn't have to work in order to avoid starvation. Now, in the United States, economic progress was even more dramatic. Capitalism and the scientific, technological, industrial revolutions reached their full fruition there in the late 19th century. America became the greatest country in the history of the world in terms of inventiveness and innovativeness. Advances such as Cyrus McCormick's Reaper, Samuel Morse's telegraph, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, Edison's electric lighting system, Henry Ford's mass production of automobiles, the Wright brothers' airplane, and numerous other devices established America as the most progressive and wealthiest society of history. Per capita living standards in America doubled between 1790 and 1860, and then doubled again between 1865 and 1915. This at a time when the country absorbed millions of destitute immigrants from Ireland, Sicily, and East European Jews. Again, these numbers are historically unprecedented. America's enormous productivity, led by such giants of industry as Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, James J. Hill, J.P. Morgan, Edward H. Harriman, et al., kept American output so far ahead of population growth that the country's high living standards became legendary as early as the turn of the 20th century. Part of the revolution in productivity brought about by capitalism was that famine, the scourge of all non-capitalist systems, both historically and currently, was wiped out in the free world. Advances in both agricultural science and agricultural technology were responsible for the tremendous abundance of food produced in America and the other Western countries. The greatest agricultural scientist of history was in America, George Washington Carver at Tuskegee Institute, and others. There has never been a famine in American history, ever. To the best of my research, there's never been a famine in the history of any capitalist nation. The significance of this is too often overlooked. In less than a century, capitalism proved mistaken the Malthusian doctrine that population growth inevitably outstrips food production. Thomas Malthus is tragically correct, however, regarding all non-capitalist societies. Look at the irony. Malthus publishes his essay on population growth in Britain in 1798, at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism is in the very process of falsifying his thesis as he's writing and publishing it. Historic irony that many historians simply ignore. Further, freedom in the Western world led to profound moral results. The principle of individual rights that formed the foundation of capitalism, known during the 18th century Enlightenment as the rights of man, led to an abolitionist movement, first in Britain, then in France, and then in the United States, that succeeded in the 19th century in abolishing the ages-old worldwide horror of human slavery. Slavery still exists all over the non-capitalist world. Sudan as Exhibit A, North Korea as Exhibit B, Mauritania as Exhibit C, I can go on. Additionally, the principle of individual rights gave the free nations of the West the moral courage to stand tall against the monstrous evils of collectivist dictatorships in the 20th century. And in those epic battles between freedom and totalitarianism that formed the most momentous events of that century, the overwhelming technological and industrial strength created by capitalism enabled the free world to defeat first the National Socialists in World War II, and then the Communists in the Cold War. And the free nations succeeded in establishing a network of trade relations that was the freest of history, beginning with the Western countries and gradually expanding around the globe. The movement toward free trade promoted peace among the participating nations, as well as mutually increased prosperity. Britain and France, for example, blood enemies for centuries, in the historic commercial treaty of 1860, removed many trade barriers between the countries, an early and important step to bringing lasting peace between them. Richard Cobden, the British 19th century advocate of capitalism and international free trade, was instrumental in getting the treaty ratified. In a letter to William Gladstone, Britain's pro-freedom, anti-imperialist Prime Minister, Cobden wrote that free trade between Britain and France and the resultant satisfaction of each other's wants was the means of, quote, counteracting the antagonism of language and race, unquote. This goal was so important, Cobden wrote in another letter to Gladstone, that, quote, to improve the moral and political relations between France and Britain by bringing them into increased commercial dependence, I would walk barefoot from Calais to Paris, unquote. The revolutionary code of individual rights and political economic freedom transfigured the Western world in the 19th century. But the rest of the globe remained mired in tribalism, dictatorship, endless savage warfare, slavery, and extreme backwardness. In the 1960s, for example, large parts of Asia, Africa, and South America were as destitute and famine-ridden as was pre-capitalist Europe. Indeed, today, early in the 21st century, many nations in the Third World possess per capita incomes below $300, just like Third World Europe 300 years ago, and hundreds of millions of human beings, probably billions, in the non-capitalist world subsist on less than $1 per day. In the late 19th century, European colonialists conquered large parts of Asia and Africa. But despite their often brutal rule, they at least built infrastructure and improved the local economies, especially the British. For example, quote from Peter Bauer, the leading economist on colonialism, much of British colonial Africa was transformed during the colonial period. Education was significantly improved, railways and roads were built, incidences of lethal disease were reduced, and slavery, slave trading, and famine were practically eliminated, unquote. When the colonialists packed their bags and went home in the years following World War II, local economic development generally ceased. All that remained was a vastly worse brutality. For example, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia regressed into the most repressive totalitarian system of human history, communism, which murdered 100 million innocent victims in 80 years, most of them in the aforementioned Asian countries. At the same time, African nations, ruled by an endless succession of dictators, whether of a socialist, military, or tribal variety, wallowed in one form of repression or another, whether incessant civil war, Somalia, unspeakable tribal slaughter, Rwanda, endless persecution, murder, and enslavement of blacks, Sudan, mind-boggling corruption and the impoverishment of the entire economic system, Zaire, theft of privately owned farms and the resultant famine, Zimbabwe, etc. Many African peoples today are far less free under brutal indigenous dictators than they were under British colonial rule. Here's a heartbreaking truth. More than 230 years after the American Revolution, freedom is virtually unknown around the globe. That is just a heartbreaking truth. I'll repeat that. More than 230 years after the American Revolution, freedom is virtually unknown around the globe. And the reason is that individual rights is absent throughout most of the world. Now, Orlando Patterson Caribbean research, I think he's a professor at Harvard, wrote the definitive research text on the history of human slavery, with slavery and social death. Slavery, examining the rise of slavery, and the practices of slavery all over the world, going back to the dawn of history. And one of the things that Professor Patterson says that just popped my eyeballs was, he said there was no word for freedom, no concept of freedom in the language of non-Western peoples until they had contact with Western culture. There's no word for freedom. And I think the underlying principle there is that there's the principle of individual rights has had a very short history. It originates in the West and had currency there briefly in the 18th century. During the 18th century Enlightenment and during parts of the 19th century. Today in the West, it's almost been destroyed by Marxism and various forms of collectivism. Your life doesn't belong to you anymore; it belongs to the state. It had a brief and glorious history in the Western world, as almost unknown. The principle of individual rights is almost unknown in the Western world today, or anywhere else ever. So that when I thought about Professor Patterson's point that there was no word for freedom in the languages of so many non-Western cultures, I realize it's because the principle of individual rights has had such a short history. But here's the good news. Very quietly, the post-World War II period also gave rise to profoundly positive developments. The great moral political struggle of the era was capitalism versus communism, freedom versus totalitarianism, individualism versus collectivism. Not all the starving third world countries were conquered by the communists. Some, protected by America and her allies, were able to live in freedom. Taiwan, South Korea, for example. And because they were free, they were able to choose, to decide between the opposing systems of capitalism and socialism. The most historic, important, and positive development in the world in the past 50 years is the spread of capitalism into the non-Western countries of the third world. Let me repeat that. The most historic, important, and positive development in the world in the past 50, even 60 years is the spread of capitalism into the non-Western countries of the third world. This phenomenon, too rarely discussed in our schools, universities, and media, is the single greatest hope for world peace and prosperity. The destitute countries of Asia led the way. The shining light of late 20th century global capitalism and the paradigm for the subsequent Asian tigers was Japan. The American occupation of Japan under General Douglas MacArthur transformed the country from a brutal military dictatorship, to put it mildly, into the freest country of Asia. The Japanese Constitution of 1947, drawn up in MacArthur's headquarters, helped establish a limited government in the country. In conjunction with other laws of the American occupation, the new Constitution brought freedom and individual rights to Japan for the first time. Economically, the new Japan was established on essentially a free enterprise basis, embodying substantial elements of private ownership of businesses and farms and the profit seeking. By the early 1950s, Japan's post-war construction was completed, and it stood on the threshold of spectacular economic progress. For the next 20 years, Japan achieved a growth rate that averaged close to 10% annually. Japanese productivity in the late 20th century became legendary because in mere decades, Japan joined the world leaders, in many cases became the world leader in the manufacture of automobiles, watches, radios, televisions, cameras, steel, and such high-tech products as jets, semiconductors, computers, and telecommunication equipment. Today, Japanese per capita income is approximating $30,000, making it truly an economic powerhouse. America had helped create an economic giant, and it was good. Now, the other leading light of post-war global capitalism was Hong Kong, already described. But the growth of Taiwan has been almost as spectacular. In 1949, After the nationalists' military defeat on the mainland, the island's per capita income was an abysmal $100. But Chiang Kai-shek, the political leader, sought to create an environment in which entrepreneurs would flourish. He appointed such economic advisors as K.Y. Yin and K.T. Lee, both strong advocates of a free market system. Lee realized that the best thing a government could do was provide a rational legal framework that would establish the rule of law. He proceeded to put himself in the shoes of investors and looked at the situation from their perspective. Taiwan opened up to foreign investment and world trade and phased out protectionism, strengthening domestic firms by subjecting them to foreign competition at home. The result of Taiwan's freedom has been a spectacular climb from rags to riches. Its per capita income in 1998 was roughly $14,000, meaning that its wealth had increased 140 times in 50 years. Wow. Its wealth had increased 140 times in 50 years. Or put in other terms, its per capita wealth had doubled 7 times during that period. Now, communist China, by contrast, just across the bay there, was a brutally oppressive dictatorship where Mao Zedong murdered, we don't know, current estimates of 60 to 80 million, making Mao the worst mass murderer of history. 60 to 80 million innocent victims in the relentless class warfare that the communists fight. Mao's policies caused massive famine, and nobody knows how many people starved to death, and a destitution so pervasive that by the end of his regime in the mid-1970s, hundreds of millions of Chinese were subsisting on less than $1 a day. China made no economic advances until Deng Xiaoping introduced elements of capitalism into its system in the late 1970s. What was Deng's famous line? That he didn't care whether the cat was white or black as long as it caught mice, right? He didn't care. He was a doctrinaire Marxist just like Mao, but I guess he had some degree of humanity. He didn't want to see millions of people starve. He wanted to raise living standards, and so he didn't care whether the economic system was capitalist or socialist as long as it created wealth. So, by late 1970s, early 1980s, the Chinese regime allowed farmers some plots of private property on which to grow crops that were privately owned that they could sell in the marketplace for profit. They established what they called special enterprise zones that permitted a degree of private ownership and profit seeking. They opened the country up gradually to foreign trade. And China finally began the agonizing climb out of crushing poverty. Today, China's per capita income is roughly $1,000, rising slowly from the starvation standards that held under Mao. But despite the intermixture of some free elements, China remains a brutal dictatorship. It may not be a Marxist dictatorship anymore. It's akin now to a garden variety, brutal military dictatorship. But it stifles free thinking, and consequently can never achieve, can never equal the economic productivity of vastly freer Taiwan's semi-capitalist system, much less Hong Kong's. Now, in spite of the pervasive atrocities committed by Mao, the march of global capitalism in Asia could not be halted. Korea, divided in 1945 into freer and totalitarian halves, provided extraordinarily difficult circumstances and a stern test for the budding capitalist system. For one thing, the communist North Korea received most of the Japanese-built industry. The freer South got very little. For another, South Korea was devastated by the communist invasion of the early 1950s. The war ended in 1953, and it was not until 1963 that the South's per capita income reached $100. But in the past 40 years, South Korea's economic progress has been extraordinary. Under the influence of Stanford-trained economist Kim Jae-ik, the South Korean government moved toward privatization and diminished state intervention during the 1980s. Today, South Korea's per capita income is roughly $11,000, an enormous increase over what it was just 40 years ago. By contrast, the communist North is so primitive that satellite photographs at night reveal mostly darkness, because the country either shuts down at whatever little electricity it has, or it just fails. and even massive aid from the United States and other capitalist nations was insufficient to prevent, by conservative estimate, tens of thousands of human beings from starving to death there in the past 10 to 20 years. The success of the Asian tigers is a phenomenon of momentous historic significance, for it shows that Western concepts of reason, individual rights, limited government, rule of law, political economic freedom, and capitalism can be successfully established in previously non-Western third world countries. Let me repeat that. The success of the Asian tigers is a phenomenon of momentous historic significance, for it shows that Western concepts of reason, individual rights, limited government, rule of law, political economic freedom, and capitalism can be successfully established in previously non-Western third world countries. The Soviet Union and its conquered satellite states, the Soviet Empire, failed in their attempt to export communism around the world. And today, early in the 21st century, communism is dead as a force able to inspire billions or move the world. But the drive toward global capitalism continues. This includes several former slave states of the Soviet Empire. For example, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic have taken substantial steps toward establishing legitimate political freedom in their countries, protecting the individual's freedom of speech, of intellectual expression, of voting rights, of religion, etc. In economics, these were the former Soviet-dominated states that moved most rapidly toward capitalism, i.e., that instituted privatization, deregulation, free trade, and above all, protection of private property rights. Poland had been destitute under communism. It was a so-called shortage economy because of the continuing dearth of consumer goods, including food. Indeed, in the 1970s, Poland had found it necessary to borrow billions of dollars from the West and, unable to feed its population, imported enormous amounts of food from the United States and Canada. After the fall of communism in 1989, the new government, freely elected, initiated economic shock therapy, a rapid transition to capitalism. Improvements were dramatic. Between late 1989 and June of 1992, real wages rose sevenfold, and by 1997, over 2 million new businesses had been opened. Economic growth averaged 6% a year from the mid to the late 1990s. Poland under communism had been referred to as an economic basket case, but now was dubbed Europe's new tiger. Even several dictators have been forced by the imminent collapse of their system into permitting some elements of individual rights and capitalism. Deng Xiaoping, as cited, introduced various free market reforms into China's oppressive system. Now, the taste of economic freedom helped incite student uprisings in 1989, in which hundreds of thousands demonstrated in favor of increased individual freedoms. The massacre in Tiananmen Square in June 1989 squashed that specific revolt. But the communists will, in time, discover the contradiction inherent in any attempt to combine elements of economic freedom with a brutal political dictatorship. In fact, Mikhail Gorbachev has already discovered the flaw in that plan. Gorbachev, who joined Gorbachev joined the Communist Party during Stalin's regime, along with Hitler, the second worst mass murderer in history. And Gorbachev was the protege of Yuri Andropov, head of the KGB, the most repressive secret police apparatus of history. Nevertheless, at some point, Gorbachev simply grew sick of the bloodshed and brutality. And he initiated various reforms in the Soviet Union in support of limited freedom that led to the eventual collapse of communism there. Some dictators are gaining a faint glimmer of understanding that freedom is necessary to produce economic abundance. But when a totalitarian state grants its citizens a small taste of it, it simply whets their appetite for the full banquet. In South America, the pattern of statists and dictators forced voluntarily toward capitalism and freedom continued. In Chile, In 1973, General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the communist regime of Salvador Allende in a bloody coup and established a military dictatorship that lasted for 16 years. Pinochet's rule was brutally suppressive. It was akin to military states the world over, except for one remarkable fact. Instead of gripping the economy in a tight-fisted command system, Pinochet loosened the reins over the economic life of the individual and moved the country in the direction of a free market. It was an extraordinary sequence of events. Here was a bloody-handed dictator studying the theories of economic freedom with a series of University of Chicago professors that included Nobel laureate Milton Friedman. Astonishingly, Pinochet followed through by applying his lessons in practice. His regime swept aside the disastrous communist policies of Allende's rule. Allende had nationalized the industries, his regime had seized the farms, he had hyperinflated the money supply, and Pinochet introduced elements of capitalism. He privatized the state-owned companies, deregulated the financial sector, ended the hyperinflation, brought significant elements of private ownership and profit-seeking back into the agricultural sector, and he removed trade barriers. After several painful years of readjustment, economic progress became a reality. In 1980, the World Bank reported, quote, "Under extraordinarily unfavorable circumstances, the Chilean authorities have engineered an economic turnaround without precedent in the history of Chile," unquote. Pinochet found, however, like Deng and like Gorbachev, that economic freedom has political consequences. As the 1980s advanced, economic freedom led to ever-increasing demands for political freedom, and the fear of Pinochet's dreaded secret police, the DINA, did not deter Chileans from following the logic of a free economy and pressing for a return to full voting rights. After all, if I have certain rights in the economic sphere, why don't I have those rights in other parts of my life? In 1989, the dictator yielded, agreeing to open elections in which he was finally voted out of office. Currently, Chile enjoys a vastly freer political system that it had under either Allende or Pinochet, one allied with an economic system of substantial free market elements. As a consequence, as of several years ago, I don't know, I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but its per capita income of $4,800 was significantly higher than such repressed neighbors as Paraguay and Ecuador, and it was rising. Now, capitalism has been instituted on 3 continents: Europe, North America, Asia. It's beginning to make very slow inroads into a 4th, South America. Statism, the system that denies individual rights and subordinates human beings to the state. Your life belongs to the state, hence the name statism. Whether in the form of feudalism, socialism, communism, fascism, whatever, statism in some form has been the historic and remains the current status quo throughout most of the world. If historic and current political economic systems are viewed as a great laboratory, testing the contrasting effects of freedom and dictatorship, then honest observers now have abundant evidence upon which to draw a conclusion. Capitalism, the system of individual rights, has brought increased freedom to human beings all over the world, at least in Europe, North America, and parts of Asia. In Europe, capitalism and its principle of individual rights ended feudalism and the monarchy, that is, the dictatorship of the aristocracy. In America, the principle of individual rights impelled the British colonists to throw off the rule of the monarchy and establish history's freest nation. And the logic of the country's founding principles of individual rights led, in less than a century, to the abolition of slavery, a practice that had existed everywhere in the world throughout all of history, and one that's still widespread today throughout the non-capitalist world. In Japan, under America's influence, a semi-capitalist, vastly freer society replaced the bloody military dictatorship that preceded it. In Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea, the freedom of their capitalist or semi-capitalist systems enabled those countries or colonies to become havens for millions of refugees fleeing communism. More broadly, it is to the capitalist or semi-capitalist nations across the globe that immigrants come, especially to America, millions of them, and even more if they'd open the borders. Millions of them, both historically and currently, often fleeing religious and/or political persecution in their homelands. They come on rafts to the United States from Cuba. I'm sure as many people in this audience have to be reminded of Elian Gonzalez and that tragic story of his mother drowning, trying to get to freedom. By the millions, but we might have forgotten, a lot of Americans have forgotten, so let me remind you. By the millions, and for 15 years, the Vietnamese boat people fled for their lives from communism. And today, more than 1.6 million have found freedom, mostly in the West, many in America. Muslims seeking political and religious freedom free to the Western nations from all over the Islamic world. I could go on and on with this, but when borders are open, when people can get out of of their repressed nations, and when the American borders were open and people could get in, in other words, when people are allowed to vote with their feet, there's the immigration patterns are unmistakable. Immigration patterns flow from the more politically repressed nations to the more politically free nations. Overwhelmingly, they move from people want to move from repression to freedom. And I think the main reason for that is exactly that point. Many people want to be free to guide their own lives by their own thinking and not have the state tell them what to do and/or take care of them. They want to guide their lives by their own thinking. They want to take care of themselves because they know what's best for themselves or their children better than the government knows what's good for them or their children. And secondarily, of course, related to that, the enormous increase in economic prosperity that's based in political freedom. Now, Ayn Rand points out in Atlas Shrugged, if you haven't read it, I strongly advise everybody to read or reread Atlas Shrugged. Ayn Rand establishes in that great novel, that great story, that this, the mind, is mankind's instrument of survival, and that the mind needs to be free. And when the mind is free, you see the outpourings of advances in every field, whether technology is the clear example. The late 19th century America, politically freest nation in history. Edison's electric lighting system, Bell and the telephone, the Wright brothers in aviation, the creation of skyscrapers and cures for diseases, and you can go on and on. But also, in every field, new theories in physics, biology, and you're free to not only develop new ideas, but to express them. You can lecture on it, write books, publish them, etc. You don't have the censorship, of the statist regimes. And you see the explosion of advances in every field. I mean, take America as an example. It's a very young nation. Look at the tremendous body of national literature created in this young nation. This is the 19th century alone, when it was a very young nation. Hawthorne, Poe, Melville, Whitman, Mark Twain, you can go on and on with these great writers. And philosophy, I would argue that Ayn Rand is the greatest philosopher since Aristotle. From the Soviet Union, where does she come? In what country does she revolutionize our understanding of philosophy? In the United States, where she's free to publish The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, and non-fiction works. What would have happened to her in the Soviet Union? No, she'd been killed. You can go on and on. Where was the birth of the? You look at the birth of the arts, not just technology in the free nations where the mind is free, where individual your right to your own mind is protected. After all, it stands to reason. If you have the right to your own life, then you have the right to your own mind. If your life belongs to you, then your mind belongs to you. Conversely, if your life belongs to the state, then your mind belongs to the state. And the only thinking you're allowed to do is that which is circumscribed by the political authorities. So in every field, you see these tremendous advances in capitalism. Now, the science, technology, and industrialization are the famous examples. But look at the humanities. Where was the film industry created? In America. Where was the mass publishing industry created? In America. Where was the music industry created? In America. Well, you get the idea. You free the mind, and you see tremendous advances in every field. and the tremendous increase in the material and intellectual wealth. Tremendous advances in material and intellectual wealth. This is why the immigration patterns show what they show. The intelligent layman vastly, overwhelmingly prefer capitalism to any form of statism, including socialism. The intelligent laymen vastly, overwhelmingly prefer capitalism. The intellectuals, the humanities intellectuals prefer socialism. That simply shows us that the intelligent layman is a lot more intelligent than the intellectuals. Generally. Now, here's the last question for us. What can we do? What can we do to help promote global capitalism? And I said there are three things that every one of us can do to help spread individual rights, freedom, and prosperity around the globe. Now let me go in ascending order of importance. One, we can understand the principle and support the policy of international free trade. Free trade simply means that individuals and companies in one country can trade with individuals and companies in other countries without barriers and or taxes imposed by their respective governments. Morally, it is the right of an individual to engage in voluntary trade with any individual he chooses, so long as they are not engaged in criminal acts, right? So long as they're not initiating force or fraud against others. Now, governments, when you're dealing with non-criminals or non-terrorists, with those who do not initiate force or fraud, then governments must respect and protect the right of free trade. For example, just as American customers are free to purchase as many domestic automobiles as they choose, so should they be free to buy as many Japanese cars as they please. That Japanese manufacturers are generally of a different nationality, ethnic group, or race than American customers is irrelevant. International free trade is simply the principle of individual rights applied to economic relationships across national boundaries. Let me repeat that. The principle of international free trade is simply the principle of individual rights applied to economic transactions across national boundaries. If an American individual believes that he should buy American out of loyalty to the United States, that is his right as an individual customer, although it shows egregious ignorance of basic economic principles. Still, somebody's right to be ignorant. But he should not vote for tariffs and trade barriers that make it more expensive or even impossible for other Americans to buy imported goods. The essence of America is individual rights. This principle includes the right of individuals to trade freely with other individuals, both at home and abroad. Restricting free trade is violating the right of men to trade freely with individuals of other countries, and that is what is truly un-American. Economically, the results of international free trade are mutually increased prosperity. In his great work, The Wealth of Nations, published fittingly in 1776, Adam Smith provided the economic argument in favor of free trade. Quote, "In every country, it always is and must be the interest of the great body of the people to buy whatever they want of those who sell it cheapest." You can't make the case any clearer than that. If you're economically, let me repeat that from Adam Smith. In every country, it always is and must be the interest of the great body of the people to buy whatever they want of those who sell it cheapest. Therefore, if the people of nation X manufacture widgets less expensively than do the people of nation Y, it is to the interest of the citizens of nation Y to buy the foreign-made widgets. If the Americans, for example, manufacture software less expensively than do the South Koreans, the frugal policy for the South Koreans is to purchase American software. Smith pointed out, he didn't talk about software, but he did. His principle, my example. Smith points out that every country has specific natural advantages in terms of mineral resources, rivers and streams, fertile lands, weather, topography, etc., that gives them a competitive advantage over other lands in the production of specific commodities. France, for example, has the climate and the terrain enabling its inhabitants to produce high-quality wines at a relatively low cost. Adam Smith, a Scot, pointed out that the Scots too could produce excellent wines if they desired to, but given Scotland's colder climate, the production of Scottish wine would require the allocation of so much time, labor, and resources that the resulting product would be prohibitively expensive. It was far cheaper and wiser for the Scots to produce the goods regarding whose manufacture they held the natural advantage, and then to trade with the French for wine. There is a division of labor involved. The road to prosperity is for individuals and countries to produce what each excels at, and then to trade peacefully with men all over the globe for the other goods that they desire. A further advantage of international free trade, as I mentioned briefly, is that by promoting cooperative and mutually beneficial relations between countries, free trade tends to reduce tensions and national rivalries, and so to function as a spur to peace. Tariffs and trade barriers, on the other hand, increase mutual suspicions and antagonisms and result in strained relations between countries. To the extent that economic factors are responsible for wars, and I think that's an overrated factor, I'm not a Marxist, you probably figured that out by this time, but to whatever extent economic factors are responsible for wars, restrictions on free trade are a major part of it. Now, two, we, the free and the wealthy of the capitalist world, must stand up and proudly proclaim the moral, political, and economic superiority of our system to that of the blood-drenched statist regimes around the globe. We must boldly announce that it is only by enacting in their own countries the principles of individual rights, limited government, political economic freedom, and capitalism that the oppressed and destitute peoples of the world will achieve freedom and affluence. In this regard, the Ayn Rand Institute has published an op-ed essay by a citizen of Zimbabwe, a nation suffering under the yoke of the Marxist tyrant Robert Mugabe. The writer, Stephen Tennant, describes numerous crimes committed by Mugabe's regime. The ongoing beatings, torture, rape, and murder of thousands of Zimbabwean citizens on the dictator's orders. Stephen Tennant points out that today, because of the regime's theft of thousands of farms and killed off God knows how many productive farmers, nearly 8 million Zimbabweans face starvation. He concluded his piece with an appeal to America for help. He says, quote, "On behalf of the Zimbabweans who desire to live as human beings, free from the shackles of Mugabe's tyranny, I have a favor to ask of you, America. No, it is not a request for a check or some other handout, nor is it a request to send over your 4th Infantry Division to liberate us. Our suffering does not give us a right to your wealth or to the lives of your brave soldiers. No, the favor I have to ask is very different and far simpler. America, stop apologizing for your greatness. Stand up and proudly champion the principles that have enabled you to earn your wealth and your power, capitalism, and the individual's inalienable rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. Condemn every form of tyranny and tell the world that the political system created by your founders is the only noble system the world has ever seen. Tell every individual across the globe, no matter if he is black, white, Arab, or whatever, the only path to freedom and prosperity is through the ideas contained in your Constitution and your Bill of Rights. To modify a saying from one of your great founders, George Washington, proclaim a standard to which the wise and the just can repair. To do so costs you nothing and will achieve much. You will give hope and inspiration to every individual in Zimbabwe, Iran, Hong Kong, or elsewhere who is actually fighting for his liberty. You will earn the respect of freedom-loving people the world over, the only world opinion it could ever make sense to win. And by your moral certainty, you will strike fear in the hearts of your enemies and any tyrant who dares to violate the rights of the individual. America, when you refuse to speak out against evil, and worse, when you apologize for your virtues, you discourage those who love liberty, and you give hope to the Mugabes of the world. But when you proudly and guiltlessly stand up for the good, you help move the world towards your ideals. America, your moral voice is at once your least costly and your most powerful weapon. A lonely individual from Zimbabwe asks of you only this: won't you use that voice? Unquote from Stephen Tenet. If America follows Mr. Tenet's advice, it will truly become a beacon of liberty for all the oppressed peoples of the earth, even more than it already is. Third, and most important, freedom and prosperity are eminently obtainable by human beings. The history of the Western world in the past 200 years shows us that, as does the spread of capitalism into Asia in the past 60 years. But although men have often hungered, fought, and died for freedom throughout the ages, they have not yet understood its nature. They have failed to understand the philosophic principles that underlie and give rise to man's need for freedom. Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged identified those underlying principles. The mind is man's tool of survival. Every value life depends on is a product of the mind. Food must be grown, requiring knowledge of agricultural science and agricultural technology, requiring the mind. Houses must be built, requiring knowledge of architecture, engineering, mathematics, requiring the mind. Medicines must be researched and developed, requiring knowledge of biology, requiring the mind. I can go on. Every value human life depends on is a product of the reasoning mind. And the mind requires freedom. I've already made that. In a free country, every innovative mind is free to come up with new ideas and new ways to do things, and revolutionize various fields. Gave many examples. Under dictatorship, the only thinking you're allowed to do is that which the dictator permits you to do. So the mind, mankind's survival instrument, requires political economic freedom. Therefore, an individual human being must be left free to act on his own rational judgment. He must be left free to act on his instrument of survival. Human individuals must be protected from the initiation of force against them by either private criminals, above all by the government. It is to protect the individual's right to live by his own mind, to be guided by his survival instrument. This is why a society needs limited constitutional government with a Bill of Rights guaranteeing individuals freedom of action in any number of areas. After thousands of years of human struggle, Ayn Rand has provided the intellectual insights validating that struggle, showing that and why freedom is a necessity of human survival. We need to understand this. If we are to be effective activists on behalf of global freedom, we must understand the philosophic principles that make freedom necessary and possible. We must read and comprehend Atlas Shrugged. We must encourage everybody we know to do the same. We must teach Ayn Rand's principles to our children, our students, our friends, our acquaintances. We must incorporate these ideas into our activism on behalf of global freedom. If we do that, if we campaign as fully knowledgeable intellectual activists, then our battle for global freedom will be won. The principles and practices of capitalism will be spread around the world. And then the repression and the destitution of the communist and various third world dictatorships can be obliterated. Individuals of those countries will be free and as wealthy as we are. Think about it. 7 billion people free. Think of the possibilities. 7 billion human minds free to work on the problems of human survival. Think about the advances that would be possible. Capitalism has liberated and enriched the West. It has liberated and enriched numerous Asian countries. It can and will liberate and enrich the rest of the world. Thank you.